Shalom. I am Rabbi Nathan Davidovich, speaking to you on behalf of the webyeshiva.org, speaking to you from Efrat, Israel. I'm going to talk about a little bit about this week's Torah reading. This is Parsha Vayayra. And the title of this little short discourse is, How High Does Your Love Have to Be? And maybe I picked that particular title because tonight is the Yortzeit of Rav Shlomo Carlebach, who used to say, go higher and higher and higher. Rabbi Akiva said, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your friend as yourself, is a general principle, it's a klal gadol, general principle which surrounds every commandment in the Torah. And the beginning of this week's Torah reading exemplifies how far one has to go in fulfilling that commandment. So let's look at what the beginning of the Torah portion is. At the end of last week's Torah portion, our father Abraham was commanded to circumcise himself. And now it's the third day after the circumcision, and Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, is in his tent, and he's conversing with God. The presence of God is right there with him, and he's talking, just as you and I might talk, he's talking to God. And God made it very hot. God didn't want to trouble him. He knew that Abraham was a person who loved all humanity, and he knew that he wanted people to come visit him so he could be hospitable and show them hospitality. So God made it so hot that it seemed that nobody would ever come. And in the middle of talking to God, Abraham looks out and he sees three apparent pagans coming toward him. They were dressed up as human beings, and they were bringing him two different messages. One was that in a year from this time, he and Sarah, his wife, would have a son. That was an unbelievable prophecy, because at this time Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah was 90 years old. In addition, they told him about the fact that they were coming to destroy the city of Sodom because of its cruelty and wickedness. So what does Abraham do? He's in the middle of talking to God. He says, excuse me, wait here a little bit longer. I've got to go take care of these three strangers. And he invites the strangers into his tent. He said, first wash your feet, because he thought they were pagans who worshiped the dust. So wash your feet off and come and have something to eat and drink. And he fed them and gave them to drink. And then they prophesied about his having a son. His wife Sarah wasn't right in front of them, but overheard the conversation, and she laughed to herself. And then God asked Abraham, why did your wife laugh at that prophecy? So we see just in those few sentences, we see first of all that Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, is fulfilling with his deeds, with his actions, the statement of Rabbi Akiva, love your neighbor as yourself. Abraham understood that God created a world of kindness. And God wants people to love one another and to be kind to one another. So our father Abraham demonstrated this by turning his attention to three complete strangers and saying to God, we'll talk in a few minutes. The Talmud tells us that in fact, hachnasas orchim, welcoming guests, is greater than having a face-to-face conversation with God, greater than receiving the presence of God. So he demonstrated that by his actions. Sarah, who laughed at the news that she was going to have a baby, said, how is it possible? I'm already way past childbearing age, and my husband is old. And when God recounted her conversation to Abraham, God said, why did your wife laugh and say that she can't have a baby because she's past childbearing age? He left out that Sarah said, my husband is old. That teaches a very important lesson too. God did not want to do anything to interfere with the marital bond, the marital harmony between a husband and wife. So therefore, he wouldn't say that Sarah said something that could be seen as demeaning to her husband, thinks that he's lost his masculinity. No. So God couched his words in a way that wouldn't come across. Again, this is a demonstration of how God wants us to live a life of love. Now there's an interesting comment that Rav Shlomo Carlebach made, and he asks the question. He says, first of all, he's talking about the difference between Noach and Abraham. And he said that Noach, he's spending all this time building the ark. He didn't believe that you can improve yourself. He didn't believe that you could do tshuva. He said the only way that you can keep your head above water, literally, is if you never started to do anything wrong. And he says, from the moment you're born until you die, you have to be holy. And if you get involved in this world, there's no going back. And then Shlomo Carlebach says, why did God give a son like Yitzchak to Abraham, to Avram, not to Noah? And when I gave the introduction, I said one of the reasons that the angels were coming is to give the message about the destruction of Sodom. So Shlomo Carlebach says, what does that have to do with having a son, the prophecy of having a son? And he says the answer is very simple. He says, what are you teaching your children? Are you telling your children, try to be a Jew, but I want you to know that the world is much stronger than Yiddishkeit, so try to keep away from the world? Or are you teaching your children the world is so beautiful, the trees and fields are beautiful, the Torah, Shabbos, Jerusalem is infinitely a zillion times stronger than anything in the world? So Avraham is saying that we are stronger than the world. We do not have to live in isolation on a mountaintop. We have to interact with the world and appreciate the world, appreciate the beauty of the world. And one way of appreciating the beauty of the world is to fulfill God's desire in creating this world, that Olam Chesed Yibana, that God wanted to create a world of kindness. The message that we learn from this is how we have to show love to everybody else, how we have to avoid anything that would anger anybody, that would hurt anybody. Guard your words carefully. Don't say things that will upset people. Don't say things that will demean people. Say things that will always lift another person up. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is an overriding principle in the Torah, and it should be our overriding principle in life. Thank you for listening on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. I wish everybody a wonderful Shabbat.